Winston Churchill. The hour he was made for. May 10th, 1940. London. The day history closed in the morning air in London carried the uneasy stillness of a continent about to break. At dawn, German forces surged across the Low Countries. By mid-morning, the news had reached Whitehall with the force of inevitability. The war had entered a new and terrifying phase. Inside Buckingham Palace, a political decision was unfolding that would shape the fate of Europe. At 6 p.m., Winston Churchill was summoned by King George VI and asked to form a government. He was 65 years old, stocky, already tired in appearance, with the face of a man who had lived several political lives. Many doubted him. Some feared him. Few believed he would be the one to carry Britain through its darkest hour. Yet as he later wrote, a strange calm settled over him. He felt as if every failure, every warning ignored, every lonely year in the political wilderness had led to this exact moment. By nightfall, Churchill was Prime Minister of a nation standing alone on the edge of catastrophe. May 13th, 1940, the first promise. 3 days later, he stood before the House of Commons for the first time as leader. Members expected reassurance, perhaps even optimism. Instead, he offered something far more unsettling: honesty. He spoke slowly, deliberately, letting the words land with full weight. "I have nothing to offer but blood, toil, tears, and sweat." It was not a speech meant to comfort. It was meant to prepare. Churchill understood something fundamental. A nation that expects easy victory collapses when reality arrives. A nation that expects hardship can endure almost anything. From that day on, his leadership would be defined not by false hope, but by the refusal to disguise the cost of survival. Late May 1940. The week Britain could have surrendered as German forces cut through France, the British Expeditionary Force became trapped near the coastal town of Dunkirk. Inside the War Cabinet, tension reached breaking point. Several senior figures argued that Britain should explore peace negotiations through intermediaries. They feared invasion, defeat, and the destruction of the empire. Churchill listened in silence during long, suffocating meetings. He knew the reality. If Britain sought terms, it would lose not only the war, but its independence of action, its influence, and eventually its sovereignty. On May 28th, he addressed the full cabinet with a bluntness that shocked even his allies. If the story of Britain were to end, he said, it would end only after the nation had exhausted every breath of resistance. It was a turning point, not on a battlefield, but in the realm where wars are truly decided, the human will. Britain would fight on. June 4th, 1940. The speech that defined a nation. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers had been evacuated from the beaches of Dunkirk. Militarily, it was a retreat. Psychologically, it needed to become something else. Standing again before Parliament, Churchill delivered the words that would echo across generations. He spoke of fighting on beaches, landing grounds, fields, streets, and hills. He spoke of a nation that would never surrender. The speech did more than describe resistance. It created a mental landscape in which surrender became unimaginable. In that moment, language became strategy. Summer-autumn 1940. The Blitz. Leadership under fire. As the Luftwaffe turned its attention to British cities, the war arrived in the homes of civilians. Night after night, air raid sirens pierced the darkness. Fires lit the London skyline. Families slept in underground stations, wrapped in blankets, listening to the distant rumble of bombs. Churchill refused to leave the capital. He walked through bombed streets, sometimes still smoking from recent attacks. He spoke to shopkeepers, rescue workers, mothers searching through rubble. These visits were not staged. They were acts of shared risk. He understood that leadership in wartime is not only command, it is presence. During one speech praising the fighter pilots defending Britain, he delivered a line that captured the mood of the nation. Never had so many owed so much to so few. The pilots became symbols of defiance, and Churchill, their voice. August 1941. The search for allies. By 1941, Britain remained defiant but stretched to its limits. Across the Atlantic, the United States had not yet entered the war. Churchill knew that long-term victory would be impossible without American power. He crossed the ocean to meet President Franklin Roosevelt aboard a warship off the coast of Newfoundland. The two men talked for days about strategy, about the future of democracy, about the shape of the post-war world. Together, they issued a declaration of shared principles: self-determination, economic cooperation, and collective security. It was not merely diplomacy, it was a blueprint for the world they hoped would emerge from the conflict. When Japan attacked Pearl Harbor months later, Churchill reportedly felt a profound sense of relief. Not because war had widened, but because Britain was no longer alone. 1942, the darkest year. Victory still seemed distant. British forces suffered setbacks in multiple theaters. Shipping losses in the Atlantic threatened supply lines. Public confidence wavered. Churchill faced fierce criticism in Parliament. A vote of confidence loomed. Behind the public image of bulldog resolve, the strain was immense. He worked late into the night, dictating memos, studying maps, demanding constant updates. Sleep was irregular. Meals were brief interruptions. Yet even in this period, he traveled to front lines, believing that a leader must see war firsthand to understand its true cost. He survived the political challenge. But the year left marks, proof that leadership is often endurance rather than triumph. 1943. The war-turns Allied victories began to shift momentum. In North Africa, Axis forces were pushed back. On the Eastern Front, German advances stalled and reversed. Churchill now turned increasing attention to strategy beyond the battlefield. He worried about what would happen when the war ended, especially the balance of power in Europe. At major Allied conferences, he acted as mediator and advocate, attempting to reconcile differing visions between partners whose interests were not always aligned. The war was no longer only about defeating an enemy. It was about shaping the peace that would follow. June 6, 1944, D-Day, the long-awaited return to Europe. For years, Churchill had pushed for the liberation of Western Europe. On the night before the invasion, he was restless. Reports, forecasts, and briefings filled the underground war rooms. He had wanted to witness the landings at sea, sharing the danger with the troops. The plan was rejected for fear that losing the prime minister would create a political catastrophe. Instead, he waited, watching the operation unfold through updates and maps. When confirmation arrived that Allied forces had secured their foothold, a new phase of the war had begun, the beginning of the end. February 1945. The world being divided as victory approached, Churchill met with Allied leaders to discuss post-war arrangements. The atmosphere was complex, hopeful yet tense. He understood that Britain's power had been strained by years of total war. He also understood that new global realities were emerging. His role was increasingly that of negotiator, attempting to secure a balance that would preserve stability in Europe. It was diplomacy shaped by hard lessons. Alliances win wars, but they do not erase competing visions of the future. May 8, 1945. Victory in Europe. When Germany surrendered, crowds filled the streets of London. Churchill appeared on the balcony overlooking Whitehall, greeted by a sea of faces. In his address, he did not claim triumph for himself. He credited the endurance of the British people, the civilians, the soldiers, the workers, the families who had lived through years of uncertainty. The moment was not only relief, it was release. For 5 years, survival had been the nation's central task. Now the future, with all its challenges, could begin. July 1945. The unexpected end of his leadership. Only weeks after victory, Britain held a general election. Churchill remained immensely respected as a wartime leader, but the electorate was thinking about a different battle now. Rebuilding homes, jobs, and social systems. The results surprised many. His party lost. Churchill accepted the outcome without protest. He understood that the nation he had led through war now wanted a leader for peace. The legacy of the war years. From May 1940 to July 1945, Churchill's leadership was defined not by battlefield command, but by psychological resilience. He turned speeches into strategic tools. He transformed survival into a narrative of defiance. He maintained belief during the period when defeat seemed the most rational prediction. His greatest achievement was not a single decision or campaign. It was sustaining the conviction that resistance still mattered when the outcome was uncertain. Epilogue: The Hour and the Man. Years later, Churchill reflected on the war as the defining chapter of his life. History often remembers victories as inevitable once they occur. But in the summer of 1940, nothing felt inevitable. Britain stood isolated, vulnerable, and unsure of the future. In that fragile moment, leadership was not about certainty. It was about refusing to accept that collapse was unavoidable. Churchill's war was a struggle not only against armies, but against despair, a contest to keep alive the belief that endurance could shape destiny. And for 5 years, through fear, loss, and relentless pressure, he carried that belief for an entire nation.